Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of talking about an obscure founder of the United States, I'm going to be talking about a book, or probably better put, a collection of letters, the Adams-Jefferson Letters. Now, if you are watching this channel, you are probably familiar with both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and probably John Adams' wife Abigail, whose letters to and from Thomas Jefferson are also part of this collection. But as a quick refresher, Adams and Jefferson were early rebels. They were always on the more radical side of the Revolution, and they would have met for the first time in Philadelphia, because Adams was from Massachusetts, Jefferson from Virginia. They would have met in 1775, that spring, as I said, in Philadelphia. They would have known each other throughout the year. They would have written and signed the Declaration of Independence together. And the first time that they actually write a letter to each other is 2 years after they would have met, in May of 1777. And this correspondence continues off and on for almost 50 years, 49 years. And what makes this, the reason I'm talking about this collection today, and what makes it so fascinating is, I mean, these two people would go on to be the first, the second and third presidents of the United States. They would also spend time before that as ambassadors in Europe, and they would be two very long-living former presidents. And what's really interesting is they are corresponding in real time throughout the Revolution, throughout the war, throughout Jefferson's governorship, throughout their time as ambassadors, throughout Washington's administration, throughout most of Adams's administration. They do have a falling out, and then several years later, they start communicating again, and the first half of the correspondence is, it's one of the fascinating things about the American Revolution, is we can read their conversation, we can eavesdrop of literally what they were saying to each other throughout the war. And then the second half of the book is them reflecting on their presidencies and what the Revolution means to them and to their country and to the world. It's unbelievable. Now, it is, I understand, fairly difficult to read some of the old-timey English that they communicate in. But this particular version, which I will link to in the description below, is by Lester J. Capin. I always forget his middle initial. Lester J. Capin, who has some great introductions to each section. And there is something in the introduction of the book that I want to read that I think it reflects. He singles out a quote from John Adams, which I think speaks wonders to the why I like this book so much, why everyone should read this book so much. And now this quote is John Adams talking about Thomas Jefferson's letters and why Adams thinks Jefferson should print his correspondence in volumes for the general public. And he says, though, although they may not always appear orthodox, quote, "They will exhibit a mass of taste, sense, literature, and science, presented in a sweet simplicity and a neat elegance of style, which will be read with delight in future ages." And Adams is absolutely right. Jefferson, even though he writes in that old-timey language, he still has a certain ease of reading that many of the people writing at the time did not have. Jefferson, if anything, really had mastered the English language, where, like, we can still read it today, and even though it sounds fancy and beautiful, it makes sense. You can just read it, usually in the first try. You don't have to go back and be like, all right, what does this word mean? And that kind of thing. And to be fair to Adams, he also writes in a pretty simplistic style. Now, not to take anything away from Adams, he was absolutely brilliant, but he does, he's a little more gruff with his language. Not like cuss words gruff, but like straight to the point, grumpy guy kind of writing. But in a way that's almost more American, because he's just getting to the point. So I can't recommend this book enough. You are literally reading your way through the American Revolution, and then their correspondence after their presidencies is basically one of the first histories of the Revolution, just because they're trying to sort it out. And just for some context, I did want to discuss real briefly their first letter and their last letter. So the first letter is from Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, on May 16th, 1777. So about 2 years after they met, they had spent enough time together. Jefferson's back in Virginia, and he's writing to Adams. And what's interesting is he's writing that there's not a lot to report in the South at the time. And he is talking about his concerns with the Articles of Confederation, mostly representation, because he doesn't think the small states are going to actually sign up. And he actually uses the word cede. He's afraid they might cede from the Union because the Articles of Confederation were too strong, which we know in less than a decade they'd be replaced because they seemingly were not strong enough. He also discusses the post office and how excited he is for the post office to get going. And he talks about how he's disappointed with the privacy. The Continental Congress was meeting in secret and weren't publishing their journals. And he was saying, this needs to be published. The people need to hear this. And Jefferson was always for the people. Well, at least outwardly, he was always for the people. And Adams, in a lot of ways, was the same. Now we're going to jump 49 years into the future, where they have the last letter one sends to the other, and it's Adams sends it to Jefferson on April 17th, 1826. And it's very brief. He does say he receives, the last letter he received from Jefferson was delivered by Jefferson's grandson, or two of his grandsons went to Massachusetts and delivered it. And he talks about his own son, John Quincy Adams, who at this time was President of the United States of America, because that's how far they had come, and they had passed the torch to the next generation. In my personal opinion, John Quincy Adams is kind of a founder. He worked in the Washington administration, but he's the son of founders, and he is the start of the next generation. You know, after him was Andrew Jackson, who again was very young during the Revolution, and Jackson would lead into Van Buren, who was born after the United States was a thing. So, at the end, he's talking about how John Quincy Adams, you may be familiar, made what was saw as a corrupt deal, a corrupt bargain to become president, and he made Henry Clay his Secretary of State to beat Andrew Jackson, and it was political maneuvering. And people were complaining about that. And one of these people, Mr. McDuffie, Adams is complaining about to Thomas Jefferson. And the last words ever spoken between the two, it was written, of course, but corresponded between the two, was about chivalry. And Adams, his always grumpy self, concludes, in his 90s, by the way, Our American chivalry is the worst in the world. It has no laws, no bounds, no definitions. It seems to be all caprice. My love to your family and best wishes for your health. And 2 months later, they would both pass away on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. These are two of the most important Americans. Period. I know it's a big, thick book. I know it takes forever to get through, and there's a lot here. I felt compelled to discuss it because I've referenced this so many times in the last 20 years of my life. When there's something I don't know, I go look them up in here. If there's a founder I've never heard of, I go look it up in here. They're not all in there, but they are, especially before the internet was giving me the founders online, where I could go look up hundreds of thousands of letters from one founder to another. This was my, not to sound blasphemous, but my revolutionary Bible. This is the book. And if there's one book you're going to own, written by the founders themselves, this is it. So I'm going to sign off for today. I'll be back tomorrow with a regular founder. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like. If you're new here, this is different. Usually I talk about founders, but hey, if you like this, you'll probably like the other videos. Please hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will come back with another video for you tomorrow.